Thank you for joining us for today's talk on Dorozome, Amami Oshima's unique dyeing technique. This event takes place as part of a series of events that we have around our current exhibition at the embassy, which is called Sustainable Textile Futures. The exhibition was done in collaboration with the Aalto University project, Diverse Voices in Textile, and we have with us today Dr. Chetna Prajapati, who co-curated the exhibition, and she joined us tonight as our moderator. So thank you, Chetna, for being here. Chetna is a senior lecturer in textiles at Aalto University. She is a designer, educator, and researcher. She is trained in textile design, materials and process, and biotechnologies, and her work focuses on applying biotechnology in design to address complex contemporary environmental, economic, and social challenges. So again, thank you, Chetna, for joining us. Before we begin, we have to tell you that this event is recorded, so please keep your cameras and microphones off. In addition, please use the Q&A function, and Chetna will later see all your questions, and Leonardo will answer them. Now I would like to introduce our special lecturer guest, Leonardo Hidalgo Uribe. He's a designer, a textile designer, and a PhD candidate at the Department of Design at Aalto University. His research explores biocolors and dyeing practices, examining the connection between ecological knowledge, color, aesthetics, and design. Leonardo has extensive experience in weaving, dyeing, and collection coordination, and he spent 2 months researching the Kanai Kougei dyeing factory in Japan. He will tell us more about this today. His work is now presented here at the embassy, so please come and see that if you are in London, and we are really, really happy to have him with us this evening for the event. So thank you for coming, Leonardo, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much for having me, and hello to everyone. So I'm going to share my screen and present the research work I did last year in Japan, in the island in Amami, Oshima, which is part of the Ryukyu archipelago in southern Japan. And first, I want to share with you the context of my research. So I'm a textile designer. I'm interested in weaving and dyeing techniques, and part of my research was concentrated on natural dyes or biocolors. And there's a lot of research now because of the environmental impact of the dyeing industry. And the need for biocolors, it extends to finding dyes that are degradable, processes that are not contaminant, or processes that are not high energy water consumption. And there are many techniques I have done in the past that use dyes that come from plants or elements that are part of the dyeing process that come from several biodegradable sources. However, still the logic that is dominant in the way color is explored here is still the same logic that happens in industrial and synthetic dyeing production. So still a logic of growth, of infinite choices, no matter the ecological conditions where colors are from, and like a push to whatever source of color can be there, depending on the market and needs. And that's why there is a risk of course, we can use these bio-based dyes as a source for dyeing, but they still use energy, they still use water, they still need land for growing, which can be also used for food or for keeping the diversity in several ecosystems. So the dye source is not alone something that have to be considered when we're trying to find transitions to different solutions in dyeing methods. But still, color is important. Color is part of the expression, aesthetic expression, and the poetics in different medium, including textiles. So my interest in color goes in the relationships that are related in the dyeing practice. So it's not the dyes alone, but it's the practitioners, the dyers, the places where they live, the organisms that grow there, who they're working with, and the environments where all these assemblages are happening. And then color takes an intersection between these three elements. And this is the focus of my research, how color emerges from these relationships. And I did, in my doctoral studies, I did 3 case studies in different geographies, examining dyeing practices from a craft perspective that involves direct engagement with land and organisms, and this relationship between place and practice. I did that in Finland and in the Colombian Amazon, and then last year I did my ethnographic research in Amami, Oshima, here in southern Japan, which is part of the Ryukyu archipelago, and this island is a part of a group of islands that offer a unique ecosystem due to its environmental conditions. It's part of a subtropical area, quite related to the landscape is a bit similar in a way to what I'm used to. I'm from Colombia, but in a very, very different way, of course. And it was interesting to see a place where like both land, both mountains and the sea take a huge way practices and everyday life are shaped there. So there is a long tradition of different craft techniques, particular spiritual and cultural expressions as part of the island in Amami, and both the way people approach to the mountains and the way they approach to sea and the relations between two are very predominant in all the practices, and of course all the other water bodies that are in between, like rivers. And particular, I'm going to talk about Dorozome, which is the dyeing practice that is done in Amami, Oshima, which Dorozome translates mud dyeing. And they use the mud, the soil from the island, which is very rich in iron and in contact with other plant-based dyes, particularly the ones that have tannins. They react and they make these dark colors. So they specialize in making this black that comes from this relation between soil and plants. So the main source of the dye comes from a tree called sharimbai, also called techigi in Amami. And it offers a terracotta, reddish, orangish color. And it has a high concentration of tannins, which is what is mainly used to get dark colors, particularly black. And then, as I'm saying, the soil in Amami, or certain areas of the soil in Amami, contain high concentration of iron, which is the one that reacts and makes this type of color happen. This is the tree. It's chopped and processed to do the dyeing extraction. Even the wood can give a hint of the color that it's going to make in this case, and this is the flower. And the tree is processed, like chopped in tiny pieces, then boiled for several hours, and then left them fermenting and resting for a couple of days, and then they use these tanks to then move the dyes in different parts of the process. And then when the cloth or the fibers are dyed, then they go to the mud, then the color changes, as you can see here. It looks purple, but then it starts to become brown or gray, as here. And then they repeat the process of dyeing, over dyeing the fabric again, and then go back to the mud, and then several times, and then get a deep shade of black. But this dyeing technique is part of a bigger ecosystem of craft practice with textiles in Amami called Oshima Tsumugi, which is a particular technique where they do resist dyeing with the yarns, both in the warp and the weft, before doing the weaving process, so they can do a pattern when the yarns are, in a way, by groups, dyed in specific areas where you get black here, white here, brown here, and then you put it together, and then you get the colors, the motifs. And the company where I was working, they specialized in the dyeing process. Other people do specific parts of the technique. So the yarns that are going to be dyed, they're prepared first to be like, they're woven in a way that the warp is very dense, and then the yarns are going to be, some parts are going to be preserving the original color of the fiber, and others are exposing the color. And this is what they get and then they do the dyeing process. Then you can see here in the right the yarns that are before being woven. They already can show some parts of the motif once they were dyed. And they use this type of templates or outlines to guide the process. It's very also precise and mathematical in a way that which yarns and which groups are dyed and where. And then together they make these motifs that you can see in the right. Then they're just woven like using plain weave or very simple woven structures, but then the yarns are the ones who are making the patterns. And see here you can see in the left like the groups of yarns that are already after dyed. Some parts are woven, some parts are dyed, and some are not. And then the traditional textile they do here is what is called also part of this Oshima Tsumugi, and they make these kimonos or haoris or different textiles that are used for garments or also for homeware. And of course they have changed and made different type of fabrics, but here everything is made mainly in silk, although in the past these dyeing techniques were used mostly with banana fiber, which is the fiber that was mostly used, but that was centuries ago. Then later was the introduction of silk, and then the industry going around it. And in my case, then going back to dyeing, then I work with the largest company that is remaining in Amami called Kanai Kougei, and they have been also expanding their dyeing practices to other medias, like different materials, garments, ready wear, and of course are been taking part of the industry chain of Oshima Tsumugi. But what is interesting is that also been open up to trying new techniques together with their knowledge, which is something that has made this company also being alive. Now there are like only 5 remaining dyeing houses in Amami. In the past, some decades ago, I don't remember the number, but it was higher, like 20 or 40, something like that. And in my work, I work closely with Yukihito-san, who is the son of the founder of the company. And he's in charge of the apparel area of Kanai Kougei, which means working in collaboration with brands that are making contemporary textiles that demands some experimentation and exploration of the dyeing methods with different things that they have with their clients. And with Yuki, I did kind of a collaborative process where I was learning about the techniques, being involved in the factory, and also then I'm going to show you later the development of a color library that shows the step-by-step process to analyze and understand how the color making takes place and what is related to that. And here you can see him, they do the final wash in the Toguchi River, which is another element of the factory apart from the mud field. So this is the Toguchi village, which is located kind of in northern Amami, and is the Toguchi River crosses the area coming from the mountains, and they do the final wash around in the middle here, where the water is a bit more clean. So the river takes a big part in the whole life there in the village, as well as the dyeing processes that demand a lot of water, running water that comes from underground, because there's a place that rains a lot, water that goes through the rivers, and without water there's no possibility for doing the dyeing practice. So this is a little glimpse of how the factory looks inside. People do a lot of this. They do the dyeing process by hand. They involve, it's like a bit, I don't know if I could say semi-industrialized, in the sense that compared to other natural dyeing craft, they are able to have productions, like they use like 600 kilos of this sharimba weekly, but everything demands handwork and demands a body that is interacting with all the fibers with their different elements, but they use do it in large quantities compared to what we could see in other parts. So in a way it's a factory, but still the scale it's relatively small compared to big industrial production. And as part of my experience in Amami, then I was in the factory. I went every day learning the process and also doing my color library that I will show you. And at the same time, I was moving around, exploring the island, understanding how it feels, at least during the 2 months I was there, to inhabit this place, particularly in the north. So I move around, and the approach that I do for this type of research is called sensory ethnography, where the embodied experience of being in the place in relation to others, in relation to materials, is also relevant for understanding, for building knowledge. So I took like different type of documentation, both my notes, also my own practice as a dyer who is learning there, also different audios and videos, which I compile there, that if you get the chance then to see in the exhibition, you're gonna see these videos that show this collaging of different sensory experiences of both doing the dyeing process and also being in Amami Oshima. And then I'm gonna show you like three or four type of reflections or insights that I have so far after the analysis of these experiences. So I'm been arguing that this process is very adaptative, and it reacts all the time to what's happening in the environment, which I found interesting because when I was talking with different dyers there, then they told me that there is a protocol of how to proceed in the dyeing process, but still each dyer finds its own way. It's never repeated the same way, depending both in the experience of the dyer or in the environmental conditions, and yet they get to do the kind of standardized black color because it's required for the whole ecosystem of the Oshima Tsumugi. So then later the weavers need the right hue and value of black. But the way they get there, it's all the time corresponding to what's happening. Because then, as you can see here in the images, they work with two dye baths. Here in the center, the tiny ones with the circles. This is the dye bath that they extract from the sharimbai, from the tree, before the mud. And they have one that doesn't have any additions, and then they have a second one, the red one, that has an alkali. I think it's lime. So it changes the color, and then when they dye, they go in combinations from these two dye baths in a way to do the fixing of the dyeing and also to control the hue. It can be too orange, it can be too red, because then instead of getting black, you're gonna get type of brownish color. So on the way, they're changing the dyeing ratios and then get it to the right value that they need. And everything's just by seeing. You dye, they do micro steps where you're dyeing with your hands, then you check again the color and adjust the recipe according to the protocol and according to the circumstances. So I wanted to see that. I wanted to visualize how was this step-by-step process and what was the thinking or the rationale in between or in this line of steps that go in the process. So together with Yuki, we did a color library of the step-by-step process. So every step requires like about 2 minutes. You make the dye mixture, you dip the yarns, then you get a color at the moment, and then you continue. You dye over and over and over again. So I did, we did samples with silk and cotton and also basho, which is plantain fiber, which is mainly silk is the one, as I mentioned, from the traditional Oshima Tsumugi, but also they work with different type of fibers. Cotton is very common for garments, and also part of Yuki Hito's interest was to also see how it works with plantain fiber. But mostly I'm gonna show you here with these two. So the process goes step by step. We were dyeing. I was dyeing the yarns following Yuki's kind of recipe that he suggested, that was also interesting having that conversation, because then he told me this is one process that takes more time to get to black, so you can see more reds in between, and then once you get to the mud, then the colors get darker, and then it's harder to see the nuances. And this is also a recipe that then they use for not so experienced dyers, because once they have much more knowledge, they can distinguish the different subtle changes in the hue in between the blacks, which is something that needs a trained eye. So also the dyeing process depends on the experience of the dyer. And here in my case, of course, then we're doing the mostly in the one for a novice. And all the samples, then I was numbering them and separating one by one in the steps and documenting what happened in each step. And then gradually they start to get in these dark colors. See here, you can see them also in the exhibition. They're organized. So you can see that the dyeing step number 1 happened here with this pale pink, then the second step, the third step, and go on and on and on until then the black is developed. Each step, as I mentioned, it takes about 2 minutes of interacting with the fibers. Then you change the dye bath and proceed. And then later, when you get certain depth of color, then you go to the matte. And then you can see the transition here from red to brown. And then again, dyeing until you get certain depth and go back to the matte. So gradually the color gets to black, which is it's a case of a way of dyeing that exemplifies this extreme ongoing relationship that a dyer has to have, both with fibers, the colors, and all the environmental elements that take place. And another interesting aspect is how all materials are an ongoing flow. It's not the practice, as you can see here, is fluid in terms that the color, there's always time like actions that make the color happen from pink to black, and also all the materialities involved. So the materials are not static as a tree grows in a particular land, or as the water that is flowing in the factory, and also the body of the dyers. They're all the time in constant movement, which is also something interesting to see. Water flows constantly, so the way they do the dyeing process is that there's a little flow of water, both for the washing areas and also for other areas that they need this movement constantly, so they can also remove impurities, and it prevents the fibers from staining in the different steps of the process. Same as the dye baths, also that they, as I mentioned, they get extracted, then they rest in certain tanks, then some of them are mixed with this alkali, then they're moving from place to place, and then they use the main ones that they constantly are changing. And of course happens as with color, as I mentioned in the process. So it's a very fluid practice, which is also interesting to see as any craft practice that there's some movement that is important to consider. And then working with living materials or living environments, because the mud field is right next to the factory. A factory starts around a dorota or a mud field. And then it's possible then to have all the dyeing processes when you're doing mud dyeing. So this is a mud area that was there, but then they kind of intervene and make it bigger by flooding it. And it requires constant attention because the concentration of iron changes with use or with amount of water or with the temperature. So they know what's going on with the mud field depending on the colors that they're getting in the process. If the reaction is too weak, then it means that they need to fill with more mud from other areas or do some intervention in the process. And also it holds a little ecosystem of different plants, algae. I don't have a picture, but they look so tiny, but they have tiny amphibians living there. So when you're dyeing also, you're getting entangled literally also with some branches, with flowers. There are bugs that have to, or animals that have to move away when they're getting in the mud field. So this is a surface that is also very alive. And also impacts the body. Like these are my hands that I get after dyeing with the shattering bite, they get red, and then once you get in the mud, you can see also the color affecting yourself, which is the other part that I want to talk about, which is the idea of a porous factory, which is an open space and very responsive to what's happening. And that openness involves the bodies of the dyers, of all the people, the workers in the factory. Because to do the dyeing process with the mats, you have to dive in. You have to, but not completely, but you use these long boots to get in the water. You steer the field, and then you start to bring all the iron particles or the clay that also contains iron. And sometimes, as I mentioned, you happen to find some reptile there that you have to move. And then you do the dyeing process there. The body is inside there. I have a picture of someone inside there. I think I have it later. But before that, they also have some separation. Like they divide the areas in kind of these box-like areas where each one also depends of the dyer's preferences. Some of them are working stronger than others. So you can see every part of this has a little nuance, a little change that they need to check also with the eyes or with what's happening with the color process. And for example, this area where this person wearing this raincoat is the part where mainly they use the dyeing for the Oshima Tsumugi yarns, the one for this traditional technique. Then they use others for visitors or also others for like large garments. And the dyeing process also is very corporal. They don't use, especially for the traditional one, they don't use high temperatures. When you're dyeing the one that has the reserves, if the temperature is very high, it's likely that the dye is gonna penetrate the parts that you don't want the color to be in. So they use a room temperature about 20 something degrees, and then it's the hands interacting with the fibers and kind of kneading them like clay or massaging the fibers in the dye bath. And it's a process that takes 1 to 2 minutes until then you squeeze the dye, the excess liquor, and then you change the dye bath and proceed again. So it's micro steps to get there. And the body's in constant contact. And then the body's in contact with soil, with the mud field, with water, with the dyeing fibers, with the factory, and also with the river. So it's very interesting to see how a dyeing process that involves bringing color to textiles extends to these bodies of water, like the Toguchi River, when they later do this final rinse, and I mentioned these other areas beyond. So the building itself also kind of, or the logic of the factory extends to these other spaces. And then the rinsing, the final wash they do in the river, they do it in the river because they need some certain strength of continuous water flow to remove them of mud particles, because they're hard to remove. But also it can be too strong, so they have to find a right place to do this gentle flow of water, because once the fibers are moved too much, then later for a weaver they have to disentangle all that, then will take extra step. So also these practices start to connect with each other. And this logic of washing, also this logic of the river, like this constant flow of water, it was interesting to see it also inside the factory. This is the washing station when this person is in. As they get in the river, also sometimes they get here inside the water tank. And they have 3 levels of water flowing here. One that is never touched with clean water. A second one where it's kind of dirtiness in the water. And then later, the last one, which is this heavy, for heavy loads of extra dye, they go there. Because as they tell me, the same happens in the river. If you go too up to the cleaning, then you're gonna bring dirt to the other people down there. If you go too down, then it's already too dirty. So it's a little bit a middle point for the river washing. And then this 3-step or this vertical logic of washing also happens in the process, which is also interesting to see, again, these river factory relations. And then the possibility of dyeing with sharimbai is also due to other elements in the island. These trees grow in the wild, so to say. They're not grown. Some of them are grown, but the ones that are used for this process are just grow in different areas of the island. And the way they obtain that is through relations with other people. There are people who have high knowledge of the mountains and they know how to move and how to take them, but it's still a heavy work, and it's mostly done by quite elder people, because now other generations are not much interested in doing such heavy work, which also doesn't bring much money. Or with timber companies. Like most of Amami is like this it's protected area, but there are some very specific areas where there are companies that are doing this extraction of wood. And the sharing by tree for them is just waste. So, but for Kanai Kougei is not, as well as the other companies, dyeing companies. So then they clear cut these areas and then they just leave these logs for them then to be taken later. But mostly the supply comes from these people that they come with their truck after chopping these trees and then bring them like one by one, working independently. And this is one of the most difficult parts for the supply in the future for them, because the rest, like the trees, there's still a lot of them. The extraction doesn't impact still the growing rates there, but the problem is the people who are able to pick these things. And then with the river, with the mud field, it also, they need constant care for it. So during dry seasons, they bring in water from the factory, as you can see in this tiny tube that's bringing the water there to the mud field. They also, as I mentioned, the concentration of iron starts to go down with overuse after long periods of time, and then through construction work that happens to be, for example, when someone is building a highway or a building, then they have to excavate, and then in certain areas they expose these areas of soil that contain the iron, and then they can go and pick it and bring it there. So this dyeing process also is not isolated from what is happening also in other parts of the island. And same also what comes out from the factory. With Dorozome, it involves bringing the iron from the mud. It involves bringing the lime, which is this alkali element that is also used in agriculture and food, and the use of water and the dyes there. So then the canals that then go to bring water to the river and then later to the sea, they bring these sediments. Although later, if you follow that until when the river starts to go to the sea, then it's hard then to see any color anymore, also because of the amounts they do is very little. But in the first areas around Toguchi, where there are a couple of factories, then you see this red dye from the sharimba flowing in the canals, and then when it mixes with the mud that it also comes from other parts, then it gets this dark color. And then these are some final samples that I have already during the washing process, after the washing process, and I have to organize them. And then you can see that all these elements that I'm mentioning just to get one color, black. Sometimes, of course, this in between, there's browns they use there too, but every time it's involved just to make one particular hue, which is a nice reflection to also start to consider like how we're transitioning from current both dyeing methods and also color design methods, where we're acknowledging all these webs of relations that take place when making color, involving people, involving the growth of trees, involving different interactions with the environment, and involving an open practice that requires a body to happen, requires a body and a space that is open to the world and to what is happening. For example, I forgot to mention that during rainy seasons, where sometimes the temperature cools down and there's more abundance of water and the Dorota, the mud field gets flooded, then it takes a bit extra steps to get to this black, because the temperature goes down, then the reaction with the iron is less. So then the recipe needs to know, so to say, of the dyer needs to know that this is happening, and they need to be able to adapt. At the same time happens in the dry or the sunny seasons, happens a bit the opposite, that the reaction is faster. If the reaction can go too fast for an experienced eye, then they can lose the nuances of the right hue they need to get for the color. So the time has to change. The dyeing process in Kanai Kougei is interesting that it's very responsive and reacting, as I'm repeating many times here. And also in terms of considering the dyeing sources. There are other sources for making a black, and there also in the conversations I was having mainly with Yuki, also they're experimenting with plants that they have been used a long time ago to get these blacks, because they can't rely only one source of dye, even though the whole industry revolves around it, because if it grows as the demand for this type of dyeing methods is increasing, then focusing one single organism can disimbalance a full ecosystem. So the needs for experimentation and exploration, as all these techniques that have been developed for centuries also come from this interaction and exploration. And then evolves deep knowledge that then is transmitted through generations, but is not rigid as the everyday practices can be seen here. I think I went a bit in the time a bit ahead, but I think that's good. So I want to thank again to all the members of Kanai Kougei, to Yukihito-san mainly, who was the one who was assisting me and who we have like very nice conversations, and to the people of Amami Oshima for this experience. And it was great for me to share these 2 months with them, both as a practitioner, as someone who's learning, someone who has been doing these dyeing practices in other parts of the world, and kind of being able to talk about them and learn from a particular place that brings many interesting insights for textiles, for color, and for dyeing processes in general, and for thinking about our relationship with our material world. So thank you very much, and I think I can stop here.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Leonardo, and hello to everyone who's in this virtual room. I'd like to open the floor up for some questions. We have got a chat, a Q&A spot for you to drop your questions into, so please do type them into there, and then I can ask Leonardo any questions that you might have. But to start the session off in terms of a fascinating process, so thank you very much for the insights into how Dorozome, I think is how I'm gonna, sorry, I'm not so familiar with the process, but I've seen it being documented many times, which is incredibly fascinating. Now my understanding, Leonardo, is that this process has been documented, and we've been using this process since the 8th century is my understanding. And you've explained the process really well, and you can see that it's quite labor intensive. Is there much of an appetite, in your opinion, like Yuki and the younger generation, to continue practicing this traditional dyeing process and method? You mentioned a little about experimenting with new types of yarns and processes and other products. Could you elaborate a little bit on that in terms of Yuki's thoughts on that, knowing that he's, the next generation taking on maybe the factory?
Yes, there has been like a big change in the business model of the factory. They tended to have this openness to work with customers beyond the Oshima Tsumugi industry, but then it started to become more organized or institutionalized within their business practices, which was something interesting, because then they, especially in Yukihito's practice, that then he also does some artistic work, that does some small scale production collaborations, also as a way to showcase the capacity of their company as a dyeing house or as a place for experimentation for both artists and brands. That has also bring good sources of income for the factory, because relying on the Oshima Tsumugi industry, which still brings some revenue, is still shrinking and shrinking, and more because of the particular goods and that they're doing, which appeal to still people who have a particular taste for traditional kimonos and this type of garments. And then in terms of people who are interested in the practice, I noticed, and this is just because of just during the 2 months I was there, so of course they could talk about this way better than me, but I saw young people, like about my age, perhaps younger, who from other parts of Japan, actually, not from Amami, but from Kagoshima, mainly from Kyushu, but other areas of Japan. Then they happen to be there, interested in the island, they live there, and then finding some source of income, and then happen to be there. All with interests also with artistic interests with textile related interests. I met one person who works there assisting for the workshops they do with customers or tourists, but also then in her other, that's a part-time job, and then the other part-time she does is for the weaving of that. And the thing is that it's very labor intensive, and working for that doesn't bring that much money unless you are the one who is owning it, and still it's both a mixture of like the passion to do it and the possibility of doing that, because of course it's not that easy. And I could tell then in my context back home in Colombia that there has been a growing interest from like younger generation also to learn techniques that have been broken in the continuity of knowledge because of the particular conditions that happen in Colombia because of colonial past and etc. And also in the last decade, reconnection also with cultural expressions from there, which also goes a bit hand in hand with both artistic experiences or materials and crafts. So with many people with music and other traditions to do it in their own way. Yeah,
really exciting in terms of the opportunities that exist out there. We've got, I think, Leonardo, you're going to have to put your Instagram account details back up
yes,
if that's okay. I think
yes.
Gretchen's keen to follow you. We have a question from Laura. So let me just get to the question. So Laura's asking, are there any other materials as tannins other than the wood that is used in this Dorozome process? Are there other materials that have tannins in there that are used as part of this process?
Many different fibers. Even I saw when there was a company that makes shoes with discarded textile materials from cars, mainly from the airbags. So that nylon, the nylon that is used for the airbags, and then is used for shoes. Then they were dyeing that, which was surprising for me to see how it was able to get color, and also some other material like bone, for example, because in the river, when people, the river is also used for, I don't know the name for that in English, but it's common to eat goat there in the island. And then some people that do the full process of preparing the meat, then they go to the river to do all the, I don't know the word for that, but to cleaning and removing the flesh from the animal. And then the bones are sometimes left over there. And then Yuki started to experiment with the bones also.
Right, okay.
So that was also interesting to see to how far they're also trying to, and how open also they are to experiment with different materials, even more than fibers.
Yes, to color them. But in terms of, I think what Laura was getting at was, other than the wood, so the trees that are used to generate the color, it's okay. I mean, you were answering in a different projects, but in terms of the wood, it's obviously a native tree that's being used, and the tannins being extracted to color the fiber. Are there other materials like that are other plants or flowers and so on that are being also experimented with to see whether you can extend the color range?
Yes, sorry, I heard that wrong then.
Okay.
In the case of Kanai Kougei, they've been working with fukugi, which is a tree that is used a lot in Okinawa. It makes a very bright yellow. They also work with indigo, with the Ryukyu indigo, which has a particular shade different to the most common indigo that is known worldwide. It's a little bit more turquoise or more greenish, so to say. And well, they work with akane, which is also this source of red. color, and then they work with the combinations of them. And there's some local plants, but I didn't have the chance to see that because they told me they were not still like properly documenting these processes, but there are many other different trees that bring colors local from Amami.
Yeah, from that region. I imagine there's lots of other plants that you could use that have other pigments or tannins that you could use. Brilliant. Thank you, Leonardo. I've got a question from Elizabeth. She's particularly interested in understanding the average age of the worker and whether they train in-house or they have prior training to joining the factory. So could you comment on that?
The age I can't tell. For like the real age I can't tell because there was I saw two big groups of people around their 30s or late 20s, and others who are much elder, 60s, 70s, and these are the very experienced ones, and then these are these younger ones who are working either for interest or for need for a job. And what was interesting that people with no experience, as long as they can have the space and the time for that, they go, and that's where they train to learn the dyeing techniques. Then it happened the same with Yukihito's dad, who first was working in another factory, and then he got all the experience. At the point he was like, okay, I think I can start my business, and then he did with Kanai Kougei in the 80s. So it's interesting to see here that compared to other kind of traditional dyeing houses or this type of craft-based spaces in Japan, that you see sometimes where there's this kind of lineage, like quite long. The technique in Amami it has this long lineage, but then you see that this business started quite early. For example, Kanai Kougei started in the mid 80s or something like that. So a bit different the nature of how this business work, at least nowadays.
Yeah, thank you. We've got a question from Marion. Could you tell us the name of the tree, the Latin name of the tree? Do you know what that would be, Leonardo?
I owe you that one.
That's a tricky one.
But I can write down. How can I write this down? I can write down again the name. Maybe in the Q&A.
Yeah, in the Q&A, maybe so people can see that. Yeah, thank you. And while you're doing that, I'll have a look at the next question. So, Alison is asking, does the iron affect rot the fiber or silk? And how does the high-end fabric last, etc.? So, for example, the kimono. So, could you comment on in terms of the dyeing process and how that might affect a fiber like silk?
Yes. Well, I don't have a technical study to answer that.
Yes.
But I have this conversation with Yuki because it's known that iron will degrade the fibers, and then in the long term they start to disintegrate. It happens when, for example, when you see these textiles from Peru, from ancient Incan times, where the parts that had some iron mixed, then they're away, and then you see the other ones. Yes. So it has a short-term like lifespan. But then they told me that then there is a washing step that they do different at the end. They don't end with the iron, they end again with a washing with the sharin dye, and then they go to the river. And because there were people asking that, like, well, this is with iron, I know this kimono won't last that much. And then when they start to experiment with these final steps with that, then they say that then the textiles or the fibers they're dyeing with this difference, then they have extended lifespan, according to them. I don't know the chemistry that happens there, and if it actually happens.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. That's fascinating in terms of, obviously the iron is using almost responding like a mordant in this case in terms of fixing it, but Leonardo's study and his PhD is very much focusing on the ethnographic aspect of this dyeing and that beautiful relationship that you were talking about, the land, the soil, the plants and the river interacting. I have a question from Ellie. Ellie's particularly interested in your background. So Leonardo, could you tell us a little bit more about your practice? Obviously, we know that you mentioned that you're from Colombia, but studying in Aalto University, based in Espoo, which is in Finland. Could you just comment on your background training a little bit?
Yes, so I studied design in Colombia, and then I started to focus in textiles. I learned weaving there, even though there was like not proper like weaving school or this kind of particular techniques for both dyeing and weaving. But then later I did a master's in textile design in Aalto University, kind of 6-7 years ago, and that's where I got more in-depth technical knowledge about weaving. So I do hand weaving for several years and also weaving for jacquards. I have done interior textiles for different companies and also for my own practice, both in Colombia and other parts of the world. And then dyeing is something that has been present in my career, also since my bachelor's. I did my bachelor thesis also related to natural dyes and crafts in a particular region in Colombia. And then there is like a large project that was happening some years ago called Biocolor, which was a consortium between Aalto University and other universities worldwide when they were researching bio-based dyes from very, very wide perspective, business, industry, technology, and also this type of ethnographic work. That's how I got the loop back to dyeing, which is something that has been interesting. And I've been in Japan a couple of times, like this time that I mentioned, and in the past, before my master's, I did an artist in residence there for 2 months, and then the last month I was traveling to many different craft places that I was finding online, both for weaving and dyeing, and then I got the chance to meet very nice people who are open even to show me the factory, even though I just show up without knowing anyone, and also getting acquainted with the techniques, the dyeing techniques that they do in Japan that are very interesting. And also something that I like a lot then after my experience in Amami was that I was studying a lot these techniques that they do in Japan, the way they do the dyeing, but then after being in Amami and talking with Yuki was a little bit wide opening to understand that the dyeing processes depend a lot in you or the people who are you with and the place where you are. So then the way they do dyeing in Finland is very different than they do in Japan, for example, because of the material. This hands-on intensive process with wool felted, and there you don't see that much dyeing methods related to wool in Japan. Of course, probably there's someone, but then they find how I'm adapting or how I'm using my own ways, for example, here in Finland. So there's been a kind of opening the perspectives of understand the place where I am and who I'm working with and adapting these dyeing practices.
Yeah. Thank you. Elizabeth is asking, is the older generation training the younger dyers, or are they? I imagine they are, but I mean, I think you've almost covered it, that their skills are being passed down to the younger generations, and they're picking up the practices, but also reinventing it through obviously engagement through that process of learning as well. Yeah, and you had it almost looked like a recipe card, part of your presentation. Yes, and I imagine that's accessible, and they're recording and sharing that, I imagine, and documenting it. Right, I'm just going to go to other questions. Gretchen has another question. So you've mentioned banana fibers have been used traditionally, and you've also mentioned silk. Are there particular properties associated to banana fiber that make it more suitable to this particular dyeing process? Do you know, or?
No, it's because that's the fiber that was growing in these islands. Also,
yeah, so it's quite native.
Then it was. Then at some point, I don't remember now the century, 1500s, kind of around there. Then Amami then was part of what is now Kagoshima. Then it was part of this control, those like kind of imperial control on the land of Amami. And then they needed to extend the production of textiles, including like silk production. And Amami was a suitable place for growing silk. It wasn't common or wasn't mainly used as a fiber there. It was before the plantain fiber. And then that's how it started to be introduced. And then it became later traditional fiber there. The dates you can check later. I don't know exactly.
Yeah. Laura's interested in your research in a little bit more detail. So like most PhD students, you'll be probably producing a thesis, which will be widely accessible unless items are redacted. But can you tell us, I mean, you're coming towards the end of it, is my understanding. What is the key sort of novelty maybe of your PhD do you think you're going to put out there that you can share with us? Like, is it is it the process or the engagement of the process? What do you think was one of the outcomes of undertaking this study that you'd like to share with maybe the textile and dyeing community?
Yeah, in a way, even though I'm engaging with very practical aspects, I mean, I'm using my dyeing practice and combined with ethnography as a way to study dyeing. But at the end, it's quite theoretical. What is happening is very reflective and theoretical in terms of what it means to dye textiles, what it means to then work with color that comes from this type of relationships. So then what I'm bringing then is, well, of course, both the practical aspects when you are seeing like real case studies, when this type of ongoing relationship with an environment, Amami, Oshima, the Amazon, Finland are happening, because this is based on ways of making color that are not new at all. But then the problem is that color practice in general, how it's happening, and particularly in textiles, is still very dominated by the industrial way of thinking, about the synthetic dyeing way of thinking color, which is that you can get any color whenever you want, whatever you want. And it isolates the practitioner from the place and the materialities that are involved in making color. And I think bringing back our understanding that even with synthetic dyes, there is a material relation that happens. It means that the dye also is impacting, and the color designer is impacting a particular place or environment. So opening up the body of the practitioner and the place where they're working in terms of how they're reflecting the practice is something I want to bring, so to rethink how we're working with color in general in textiles.
Yeah, fascinating. I think in terms of when I was looking at your color diaries and the color shades that you were producing, I think the darkest black was produced as a result of maybe 70 processes, I imagine. So taking out, dipping again, and building and over dyeing continuously, 70 steps. Which is incredible. I mean, you wouldn't hear of this, especially in synthetic dyeing. Traditionally, if we're dyeing silk, maybe 3-4 hours at a max, and you'd weigh out your dye in the dyeing lab and then set it to go. But yeah, I mean, the interaction with the dyer and how that the training or the knowledge and the experience they have is almost embodied in the coloration, which is really quite poetic and beautiful, actually. And especially when you were talking about how the environment changes and the concentrations of iron in the soil and so on have an impact on there. It's a really beautiful way of capturing your environment creatively. Yeah. Okay. So we are coming towards the end of this particular talk. I guess let me just have a quick look to see whether there are any other. Oh, okay. There's just one more question which will wrap this session up. So I believe your PhD will be written in English. Marian's asking, is that the case? Yes. Yeah. So when it's published, keep an eye out. It'll be linked to Aalto University, and you should be able to access it. I'm not too sure of your completion date, but I imagine it's soon approaching.
Yeah, hopefully by the end of this year. And I also have articles published
Yes.
one book chapter for everything is open access.
Mm.
Also an article about Finland, one that is hoping for review for the Amazon, and then this one about Amami also. So apart from the thesis, there are also articles written that can be read.
Brilliant. And I imagine you could just find those by Googling, to be honest. One's part of BioColors from the publication, the book itself. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So Leonardo, that wraps up all the questions. So Kiel, did you want to?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Leonardo. This was brilliant. It's so interesting to hear from your experience, and thank you for your time. Thank you also, Chetna, for your inputs. The exhibition at the embassy is still open, so please do come by if you are around London. And we share the link with all the information about the exhibition in the chat. Also, we shared Leonardo's Instagram for those who asked. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see everyone in our next events. Thank you, Leonardo. Thank you, Chetna.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much
Thanks,
for
everyone.
the invitation. And thank you, everyone.